And in the case of farmers, archaeologists have determined quite clearly that the health of people dropped precipitously immediately after agriculture.
Yes, I know. Well, did you make the case about how, because I always wondered about how did people live without dentistry? Modern I mean, it's just you get an infection, you'll be dead. And well, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, so many of the things that we're told are great gifts of civilization are, in fact, sort of partial compensation for problems that are caused by civilization. Dentistry is one of them. In fact, I just put a thing up on my website that I call the Civilized to Death Cocktail Party Cheat Sheet, which lists like the sort of most common responses you'll get from people if you start having this conversation at a cocktail party. And this is one of them. Like, wait a minute, man, I would have died from impacted wisdom teeth if I were a forager. But the thing is, foragers don't have impacted wisdom teeth. They have very few cavities. They have almost no gum disease. The combination of the diet, which is very low in sugar, and a lot of chewing creates different jaw shape. It creates much better dental health. The same can be said of other aspects of health, ranging from depression to anxiety to sexual dysfunction to heart disease. One of the clearest examples is people will say, well, what about vaccines, right? I mean, so many people died from smallpox or cholera or all these other diseases. In fact, almost all the major diseases that we suffer from are a result of civilization.
So tell me about every time they've taken, native people out. You talk about it in the book, and they try to civilize them. They invariably don't. They always want to go back to their previous life, correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's such a difficult conversation to have. It's a hard thing for people to wrap their heads around because we tend to judge quality of life by the things with which we're familiar, right? So someone will say, dude, I don't want to be a hunter gatherer. I don't know how to hunt. I don't know how to build a fire. I like my iPhone. Like, sure, you like the things you're accustomed to, and obviously don't know how to do things you weren't raised to do. So, intellectually, it's kind of hard to wrap our heads around it. But there are objective measures that we can make that aren't dependent upon where you come from or what your bias is. One of them is when people see both ways of living, which do they choose? And history is full of examples of people running away to live with the Indians and has very few examples of Indians choosing to come and live with us. So, for example, in colonial America, there were laws passed prohibiting white people from going to live with the Indians. It was against the law because so many of them were doing it.
Everybody thinks so you make the point that everybody always thinks they're living in the best time ever to be alive. And you're really making the case that, no, we're actually not. We're not happier than we were before agriculture. And in fact, we're not actually even living that much longer because of the way they count how you live, right?
Yeah, that's one of the most pernicious propaganda points, this idea that we've doubled the human lifespan. Which I bang my head against a wall every time I hear it. It's untrue. It's something that archaeologists know is untrue, but it's really hard to get that into the public conversation. So the way it works is that when they calculate average life expectancy at birth, they include infant mortality in that. So when you have a lot of babies who die, that brings the average down. And hunter-gatherers do have a lot of infant mortality. It ranges from 30 to 40% of kids who die before the age of 10. And we can talk about, that's a significant issue, and I don't want to gloss over it. But a lot of those kids are kids who would be aborted in the modern world. They're kids who have physical deformities or cognitive deformities or issues that would not allow them to survive. Those abortions are not included when we calculate average life expectancy at birth. So what happens is you have a bunch of kids who die. You have adults. If you make it past 10 or 15, you're likely to live into your 70s or 80s. But the average is 35. And so people hear that and they think people were old at 35. Everyone died at 35. That's nonsense. No human being has ever been old at the age of 35 other than maybe Mark Zuckerberg.
So yeah, you make that the average life cycle is somewhere between 68 and 72, and that we just really what medicine has really done is taught us how to drag out the last couple of years of life.
Yeah.
You make the analogy of a basketball game, the last 2 minutes take an hour, and that's how we're doing our lives these days. And I think everyone's noticed that too, right? I mean, I don't think that that's a crazy idea, is what I'm saying. I think everyone's lived through that. I think I certainly have with my grandparents and my parents. So,
Yeah. And it's interesting that the motivation for making the basketball game last so much longer, the last 2 minutes and the last year or two of life, are both commercial. It's both about making money.
that's right. They have more commercials in a basketball. That's exactly. Oh, that's hilarious.
And harbor seals live an average, I think it was 25 or 30 years. And I'm thinking, okay, wait a minute. So this seal lived, let's say he's not even old. Let's say he's 20 years lying around on warm rocks, frolicking with his friends, eating sushi, just totally chilling out. And then when the end comes, it comes so quickly that you need to slow it down to a 40th of normal speed to even see it. And at the time, my father was in the hospital dying, and he'd been in and out of hospitals for 5 or 6 years, getting every damn test that, because he had good insurance. So they were sending him in for this and that and the other thing. And I'm thinking, man, that seal had it way better than my dad, right? I wish my dad's death had to be slowed down to a 40th of normal speed so you could even see it. So I think that's the kind of thing that we're not thinking clearly about, right? We're all going to die. And part of that slavery mentality that you and I were talking about earlier is ignoring the future, right? Ignoring death, either because you're going to go to heaven and that's where you're finally going to get paid for all this work and suffering you've done, or just pretend you're never going to die, which we're encouraged to do, because then you're more likely to sacrifice the present. Which is all we have ultimately. But dying quickly is a blessing. We're all going to die. So why not die quickly? Hunter-gatherers tend to die quickly. They have active, vigorous, healthy lives, and then they die in a matter of days. And often they commit suicide when a man particularly feels like he's at the end of his days, he can't help anymore, he can't keep up, he'll wander off and end his life intentionally and by himself. And we might look at that and say, oh, that's terrible, how tragic. But man, if you spent time in hospitals, you know that there are much more tragic ways to go.